Right. Well, it's been about a week. I have, I've had some other things to do, really. I spent quite a lot of time building the printer, and yeah, I needed to get on with some other stuff, work as well, really. Um, but I have been printing some stuff. I haven't been printing like loads of benches or vases or any of that, really. It's just not really what particularly interests me, and I just think it's better. I do have quite a few things that I need to print for various things, so I just think it's better just to get on and print those and fix the problems as we go along. But as it turns out, really, there hasn't been, you know, everything I've needed to print has, with a few exceptions, printed out just fine for what I needed. The aesthetics of them is probably going to be more of an ongoing thing, and certainly the sort of finish on the outer perimeters and the surfaces really seems to be kind of filament specific, and I'm not talking material type, I'm talking brand as well. So, you know, that's kind of something that's just going to be ongoing. The great thing is that, with a few exceptions which have kind of mostly been my fault anyway, everything that I've needed to print out has printed out, and it has been accurate enough and strong enough and perfectly usable for what I wanted. So let's take a little look at these things I've printed out, shall we? So the first thing I printed out, I think, more or less, after the benches, was these little 10mm cubes, which are actually utterly pointless, really. I don't think you can really tell anything much from something this size. There really isn't enough material going down to really give you any valid judgment. What I was looking at primarily was the weight. These cubes turned out a little bit heavier than I estimate them to be, but that's another story. Other than that, kind of pointless, really. So here's a much bigger bit that I printed out. This actually is for holding my microphone, which currently is being taped on because this part is in my hand. Yeah, so the kind of purpose of this, the real main thing, was the thread on here. This is a 5/8 UNS, that's 27 threads per inch thread on there, which is a fairly rare old thread, but it happens to be the one that microphones use in their boom stands and stuff like that. So this was the first thread that I sort of cut in the modelling and then had it printed out, and I really wasn't expecting it to work that well. As it turns out, it worked absolutely fine. The threads are, well, at least strong enough for what I need. It threaded on straight away. It's it's not great, but I had absolutely no issues threading that on. It secures down tight enough. The other thing that I used this for was to start testing out sort of unsupported radiuses, and as you can see, I've sort of reached the limit here. Probably could improve it if you mucked around with cooling and all that kind of stuff, or you could just add support material. Anyway, I let it go. So the print came out pretty good. The only other thing I noticed from here is, if you look at it maybe somewhere like that, you can see just here it stepped over a bit. I have no idea why. This is the only part that I've ever printed where it has kind of done that, where it stepped over a, well, what is that? Yeah, probably a nozzle width, something like that. It doesn't really bother me. This part works fine. Yeah, at this stage, a lot of these prints I'm doing is to try and work out more about the material than the printer, or at least equally. I really would have printed this out a lot with a lot less material. Now I know the sort of strength that you get from various thicknesses. Certainly this part here is huge. It took quite a while to print out because there's a lot of material in there. But yeah, you can see the bottom. Again, I have an evolution of my first layer settings, which is sort of constantly evolving. But yeah, all in all, it works fine. So then I had a failure, and this is a mount for a sort of GoPro type camera that I'm actually not using now, but I use most of the time. This is the failure, and as you can see, this is sort of in places quite tricky. So I had these bits here where you can see there's some bridging. On this print I used no support material, and that bridging worked, well, as you can see, just fine really. There is also, this would basically have continued up at that same sort of 45-degree angle to about, I don't know, somewhere about here, and it failed. Now, when I first looked at it, and I did record the printing of this, but I didn't actually go back and look through it. I had assumed that the combination between the bridging that's going on with these gaps here, and it carried on much like this, another sort of series of bridges under here, but with a combined 45-degree angle, and I thought that that's why it had failed, because it was trying to do a bridge, as you can see with the one that it's done here. It's a bridge with a 45-degree angle top, and I thought that's why it failed. So the next print I did, which I can't really show you because it's actually in use at the moment, it's screwed to the wall and it's got a camera on it. I sort of went belt and braces route. I changed these so they didn't have a 45mm top here. This angle still needs to be 45, but I basically made the bridges flat and then just changed the height of them. And I also went for some infill, which I'll show in a picture here. That printed fine, and to be honest with you, I believe that after I went back and looked at the video, it had nothing to do with the bridging or a failure really on the print whatsoever. It was because I have yet to, and still have yet to, create a decent mount for the filament. And I think it just got stuck. I just think the extruder couldn't pull through the filament because it's just not really free enough rolling on what it's on. And yeah, it ran out of filament, so I don't think that had anything to do with the bridging. I expect it would have worked fine. The one that's come out is just perfect. It does the job excellently. So the next part that I did was this, and this is sort of part of the same part of the same assembly. This one, and I don't know whether you can see at any angle I show here, but anyway, this has a 1/4 inch, what is it, UNC, I can't remember. Anyway, it's a standard tripod thread. Again, built into the model, and it printed absolutely fine. The tripod head screws in there just fine. As you can see, I've moved to a slightly different filament here. This is 3D Prints PLA, just a gloss black, which actually, well, yeah, you can see that it's got a bit more sort of scarring on the top surface here if I hold it in the right light. I think, you know, this is just the difference between the Filamentum PLA, which didn't really exhibit so much. Well, it has a bit actually, but not so much. And this 3D Prints PLA. Yeah, subsequent prints I've attempted to sort of solve this by lowering the extrusion rate, increasing the height. I also have a little bit of warpage there, which you might be able to see. It warps up at all 4 corners. So this was printed at a very low heat bed temperature, I think 45. So subsequently I jumped up to 55, and now I'm printing at 50. Again, I think with the bed adhesion that I'm using, which is blue painter's tape, and at this time some photo mount spray glue, which is well over the top, it does stick them like, yeah, they don't come off, put it that way. But what does happen is it actually lifts the tape off of the bed, so the part remains well and truly bonded to the tape, but when it starts lifting, it's actually just lifting the tape off the bed. Then I needed to print something actually with a few more parts and a bit complicated, so let's break it down. Yeah, again, as you can see, there's huge amounts of warping going on there because that's a fairly thin and, you know, broad surface. This again was printed at probably 45 degrees C on the bed. Not really a great deal to see here. It all printed okay. There's nothing particularly radical. There's a little bit, and this is one of the little trends that I noticed, and I don't know whether I can hold it in the light. Yeah, you can just about see where it transitions from this surface here and then continues up just here. You can see a sort of, there's a, can you see it? I don't know. Yeah, just about. You can see a line. There's a one of the layer, the last layer, the top layer of that part before it starts just going vertically, pokes out a little bit, and so I'm kind of assuming that that might be being slightly too close to the bed, the Z-axis, because I did have some negative offset at the beginning to improve my first layers. The general sort of squishing out here, I think, is either extrusion, over extrusion, and maybe a bit of both, having the Z offset set to low down. But anyway, these parts printed all right. Again, this was actually a real exercise in figuring out the strengths of the material and how, how heavy I needed to build walls in order to give me the strength needed. Turns out I underestimated this material a lot. This is way stronger and way too, well, not too big, but way bigger than it needed to be. But yeah, I could have gone down to probably 2 mil would have been adequate. Really, the whole of this is just well over engineered. It could have been much smaller. And then simply this part here is just a lid, which basically secures these two parts here and that part there. And the plan with this was to glue this top plate in place. Turns out that PLA can't be glued with CA or your super glue stuff. I tried that and it just did nothing. So in hindsight, I probably would have done this more with a mechanical securing, but epoxy did the job. So yeah, I don't think there's anything much else to report on that. I then went on to print a lot of these. Now this was actually a print that I did for a friend, and I think this is the first one. It is going to be a badge for a drum, and this was my first attempt, and actually this finish on this top here has been sanded down, and I've been experimenting with sanding down the finish to see what we can get. This one is sort of printed pretty much fine, really. The results really that I get from this one is purely down to the sanding, and that is because this is quite fine detail between, let's pick an easy one, and let's take the M here. Because it is having to hop between these parts, so between there, say, and there, you get quite a bit of stringing on here. Now I have tweaked the retraction settings and mostly got rid of that, but the biggest issue is that, and if I show you one that I haven't sanded yet, here's one that's not sanded, you end up with quite a rough surface on here because it's sort of lifting, moving, dropping, lifting, moving, dropping, and that is creating little tiny spikes of filament everywhere. So again, that's pretty much down to retraction settings. But the thing with the sanding, the width of the strokes on these letters is neither here nor there. It's about let's say 4 or 5 nozzle widths apart. So what happens is you don't really get any infill, and you can't fit in exactly a full amount of perimeters. So that's a very long way of saying you get little gaps in between the strokes in the letters, which kind of gets covered up a little bit on the top with the extrusion, but as soon as you sand off the roughness, you start seeing these little gaps, and you can probably just about see one there. Well, you can see them everywhere actually, but some of them are bigger than others. The S is particularly poor there. So yeah, I printed out a lot of these, mostly because I was seeing if I could get rid of these gaps and to try and remove the roughness before sanding. And I also started trying to play with Simplify 3D. And this is the first one I did in Simplify 3D, and this one has not been sanded. Now if I hold this in the right light, yeah, there you can see, not on this top surface but on the top surface of the non-embossed area underneath, you can see some very obvious changes in sort of gloss of the material, which you don't see on this one. It's all pretty uniform underneath, or certainly a lot more uniform. This has great deviations in the sort of finish on that lower surface. This was done in Simplify 3D, and I went on to try a few more in Simplify 3D, and I basically cancelled them all because they were all, and didn't really matter what I did. Changed the settings, I lifted the nozzle up, I changed temperature, I changed extrusion multiplier, and it really made not a lot of difference. You can still see that they've got that very obvious change in sort of gloss or sheen, finish, roughness, not entirely sure what it is. And the reason why it does that, and the let's see, there's another one for you. So after trying and really failing to get rid of this in Simplify 3D, I moved back to Slicer, and so let's keep these two. So on the left we have one from Slicer, and I actually reduced the thickness overall of it, but that makes no difference to anything else. And on the right we have the one from Simplify 3D, and you can see that the actual lower surface, you know, in between the letters and that, is a lot more smooth, uniform than the one from Simplify 3D. And why that is, well, I'm not entirely sure, but basically what happens is Simplify 3D prints out a lot of these in sections and then moves somewhere else, prints out something else, and then comes back and sort of fills in bits it's missed. And during that time, for some reason that I don't know, it changes the finish on it. So yeah, that was Simplify 3D. So I went back to Slicer, and you know, the last two that I've got here are basically the more or less the same. I have changed the retraction settings on this one quite dramatically, and it has made dramatically no difference whatsoever. So yeah, all quite interesting. So what have I learned from all this? Well, it doesn't really come to any surprise to anybody, I guess, as it's been quite commonly known that really your first layer is where it's all at. Getting that right is probably, you know, the best place to start. And for that reason, you know, printing something like these things, which is nice and thin, doesn't use much material, is pretty quick. Yeah, just a disc to begin with, I think, is probably a pretty good place to start, because you can start seeing exactly how your first layer is going. Most of my prints, if they didn't fail because the filament jammed, which happened a couple of times, were basically cancelled by me after looking at the first layer. Lots of playing around. And, you know, bizarrely, some of that is stuff that I hadn't really considered, like priming the nozzle, for example. If you come down one day and you decide to print something out, to begin with, I think I was just leaving the filament in there, which meant that it just wouldn't extrude the next day. It basically gets a little bit of a, I don't know, you won't see it from there anyway, but it gets a little bit of a bell end on the end of it, which means it just won't extrude. So one of the first settings I made was to my end G code in Slicer to basically pull the filament out before it shuts off the heat, and that's the last thing that it does during the print. So that means that I need to feed it back in at the beginning, which means it needs some priming, and I spent, in fact I'm still doing it, every print I'd slightly tweak the start G code to sort of extrude out a little bit more. One of the things I noticed straight away was that if you heat up the hot end and then do the bed leveling, you end up with little blobs of filament where it just oozes out all over the bed. So I basically heat the bed up first, then do the homing, then the bed leveling, then heat up the hot end, and then basically extrude out about 10 mil, and then I run some two big thick lines outside of the normal print area to make sure that it's all coming through. Do a little wipe by moving the nozzle down really low, moving it quick so it sort of just cleans it off, and then start printing straight away. And that is been successful mostly. Lots of tweaking though. And then with the actual first layer itself, I started out, I couldn't really say why, but I started out moving the Z offset so that it was closer to the bed, to sort of really squish that first layer in. And that was actually working fine. It then, because of that probably, because I had a lower Z offset, it then looked like it was, the extrusion multiplier was slightly off. But it was sticking. It was sticking, the first layer was sticking well, the first layer looked great. What I sort of then saw was that on a lot of these prints, you've got sort of a fairly uneven, I would say, external surface between all the layers. Some are pokey outy a bit more than others. Some of them are a lot. And as I discussed it was this one. In fact, it's on all of them, but this one's particularly noticeable, where it transitions from doing a flat surface like on here, and then actually if I hold it up the way that actually prints would be better, where it transitions from a flat surface here, and obviously it's having to spend longer on this layer than it is on the subsequent ones going up. I end up with a little bit of a pokey out bit on the side there. And I think that is probably because my Z offset was getting too low, because I was thinking too much about the first layer. So what I've done with the first layer now is I've slowed it right down, by the way. It's down at, like, in slicer 50%, so it's really slow. I have put my Z offset back to 0 in the slicer. I redid my actual physical Z offset on the bed, and bear in mind, which I hadn't really, is that your offset on the bed is really dependent on how exactly what you're using to stick the stuff to the bed. I've got blue painter's tape, and if you put some kind of hairspray or whatever glue on top of that, you're drastically changing the thickness, that Z offset. I would say that the blue painter's tape is somewhere between 0.1 and 0.2 mil thick. Stick a bit of glue on there and you're quickly getting up to changing your Z offset quite dramatically. So unless you want to be changing that an awful lot, I mean, you can do it in the slicer as well, but then you'd have to end up using lots of different profiles. Much better, I think, to stick to a repeatable and uniform thickness that you're going to be printing with all the time, whether it's blue painter's tape or Captain tape or whatever. So in the end I stuck to, and I've used a feeler gauge because, well, I have feeler gauges. Everybody says, yeah, a piece of paper is fine. Yeah, well, it probably is, but there's lots of different thicknesses of paper, and you are talking about, 0.1 mil and maybe even 0.05 can make a bit of a difference here. So there's easily difference in thicknesses of paper. So as I've got feeler gauges, I used them. I set my Z offset in the firmware inside of Marlin so that it is set at 0.2 mil from my actual print surface, i.e. the masking tape. Excuse me. The masking tape with what I'm using currently, which is hairspray, and that is exactly at 0.2. And the best results I have now is by using 0 Z offset in slicer. So another thing that's not altogether surprising, I guess, but each filament, and I've only really tried 2 so far. I've got this black stuff, which is 3D Prints PLA, and I've got this red stuff, which is the Filamentum PLA. Both of those are quite different materials, and you can tell that even just by looking at them on the spool. This is a lot kind of drier, if you like. This is a little bit more plasticky, a little bit more slick. It feels a bit softer than this, and that really does sort of translate into quite different printing characteristics, which means that you're going to be, changing your slicer settings at least, for each different brand of filament, not just material. So me personally, I'd rather just get on and print stuff than fiddle around with settings once you got them right. So I'm going to be trying to pick a brand, and I don't know who that's going to be yet, but eventually I hope to pick a brand, pick a brand of filament and stick with it. So I discovered also that it's actually fairly hard to analyze these things. A lot of different problems manifest themselves with the same symptoms. For example, you know, it's quite hard to tell whether your Z offset, over extrusion or temperature is kind of affecting things like, you know, the scarring that I was seeing on these things here. No, in fact on a lot of bits, and the sort of, you know, variations in horizontal alignment as it went up. It's actually quite tricky to know what you know what's causing what you're seeing, because the kind of, you know, they all look the same, to be honest. No, I mean, to me, I mean, I'm sure to a trained eye, it's fairly obvious. But to me, you know, that's something that I've been struggling with, I would say. And it's just led to sort of, well, just randomly, I'll change the temperature, or I'll change the Z offset. Some things are obvious. So the Z offset, I've got it so that basically the first layer, which prints at 0.18 with the rest of them printing at 2, is just very slightly visibly flattened. To begin with, they were really quite flat. It stuck great, but it seemed to screw up the rest of the layers above. So I've got it now so that it's just very slightly flattened. It prints really slow, and I have no issues with it sticking whatsoever. I have less of an issue now with it bowing on the bottom, now that I've increased the bed temperature up to 60 degrees, which seems quite a lot for PLA, but anyway, hey ho, it works. And yeah, I've mucked around with the extrusion multiplier. I've had it up, I've had it down, and I'm currently back on 0, which seems to be fine. I haven't really printed anything very tall since sort of arriving at the settings I've got now, which I will be doing maybe today or tomorrow. So we'll see how that works out. I did some bridging. Well, I did some bridging. Yeah, that worked out fine. Did some bridging on the benchies, so that worked out fine. But also did some support material, and I guess that's one area where Simplify 3D really does beat Slicer hands down. However, due to the other reasons, I'll just I don't know about Slicer yet. I don't know about Simplify 3D yet. One nice thing to take away is I've had absolutely no problems with the printer itself, no mechanical or electrical issues. That has been, well, I just haven't touched it. It prints reliably. Yeah, no issues whatsoever. So that's So Simplify 3D then, I'll say a little bit about it now, and obviously I'm not really that qualified to say a great deal about it. But, you know, as the cool kids seem to use it, I thought, well, I need it. I need it in my life. Now, bizarrely, there's no trial. There's no free trial. Most software that you have to pay for, at least a significant amount of money, and it is, you know, $150 or something. You can try it out to see, especially something like that, you know, you'd think you'd be able to try it out to see how you get on with it before having to shell out your 150. You can get your money back, but you have to shell out the 150 first. Anyway, I managed to borrow a copy of Simplify 3D just to try it out, and my initial conclusions as a beginner here are that, yeah, the interface is much nicer. It has some really cool features like being able to change, you know, each layer, or settings for different layers if you like, settings for different parts on the same print. It looks a lot nicer. Yeah, and that's where it ends for me. The settings are, for a start in Slicer, you can set, or Slick 3R, you can set the actual settings for that particular print, that particular filament, and then for the printer overall separately, and save them all separately. So, you know, like example, your printer settings really, once you're dialed in, aren't going to change much from print to print to print. With Simplify 3D, you get one big panel of settings, and when you save them, you're saving everything. So you're going to have a lot more presets if you like, which isn't a big deal. I found that the settings are pretty confusing on there, and it's quite hard to find a correlation between Simplify 3D settings and Slicer settings, and, you know, particularly where speeds are concerned, there are quite a few additional settings in Slicer which just don't have any equivalents in Simplify 3D. It's a nice tool, don't get me wrong. I haven't used it a great deal, and primarily the main reason why I stopped using it was I just could not get rid of the scarring on these surfaces. You know, watching the way that it works is very different. You know, the G code that it produces is very different in terms of doing the surfaces than Slicer, in that Slicer appears to try and do as much as it can in one go on the same layer, whereas Simplify 3D will do a bit, move somewhere else, do a bit, move back, do a bit, and that seems to end up with, you know, differences in surface finish on the same layer, particularly on surface layers. So, you know, I don't right now have any need, I don't think, to change the temperature or any other setting for different layers. If and when I get to that stage of needing such features, then I might have a look at Simplify 3D again. But for now, I'm quite happy sticking with the free Slicer. So that kind of brings us up to date with what I have printed so far, with the exception of filament jams. Everything else has been either me stopping it because I just wasn't really happy with the finish, and that's really only happened on parts where the finish is important. Most of the stuff I do, the finish doesn't matter a jot. All of the functionality, they've all been fine. So yeah, now it's time probably to move on to some of the upgrades, and I originally was going to do some of the electrical upgrades first, you know, with the MOSFETs and the fuses. But actually, as it happens, it's all working okay with my sort of makeshift heatsink on the bed MOSFET. It's keeping it to a temperature where you can hold your hand or your finger on it and it doesn't burn you, and without that, I guarantee you it would have welded your finger to to the PCB if you'd done that. So yeah, that sort of seems to be okay for the moment. I will obviously change it, and I'll have to change it before I start with ABS with the increased bed temperatures. But I think what's actually going to be more useful to me right away is Octoprint, because it would just be really handy to not have to keep coming down to check it, to be honest with you. I've got the webcam I can hook up, so I'm going to do that first, and I'm going to be getting on with that in the next day or two. Day or two? Day or two. So yeah, come back if you're interested in that.